So I'm going to take you through a series of slides that's going to explore a different way to think about commissioning. So my core message is that we need to reframe the core purpose of commissioning. And the bad news is that this is going to require a new way of thinking on your part, but the good news is that it works, that it's able to produce better outcomes for less money. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through and share some of what we've learned from working with public services about how outcomes are made, about some of the problems of outcome-based contracting, and an alternative approach to framing the task of commissioning called Human.Learning.Systems. I want to start with a shared starting point, that commissioning should aim to create positive outcomes in people's lives. And I don't think that's a controversial starting point. So that leads us to the question, how are outcomes created? Because in order to commission for these outcomes, we should understand how outcomes are made. And we can have a helpful illustration of how outcomes are made using this systems map of obesity. So this was produced by the Government Office for Science in 2007. Some of you may be familiar. And what it shows is all the factors that lead to the outcome of obesity or not. 108 different factors that the public health people identified. And you can see them summed up on this systems map into areas like food production and supply, macroeconomic drivers, education, media, technology, the nature of work, the built environment, also early life experiences and healthcare and treatment options. And what this diagram shows is that an outcome like obesity is the product of all of these factors working together. So an outcome is produced by all of these factors working together in a complex system. And then to add to our understanding of how outcomes are made, we understand that that kind of map is a diagram for population level outcomes, but actually each one of us has our own unique map for how an outcome is made in our own lives. So, for example, if you take the outcome of well-being, the outcome of well-being is different in my life than your life, than your neighbour's life. So each of us has our own unique map. And next, we can understand that whilst the representation of these maps are static, actually in real life, the systems that create outcomes are dynamic. So they are constantly changing all the time. So the ways that factors interact to create an outcome are constantly changing, they are dynamic. And if we want an illustration of that, we just need to look at the effect of COVID in the world in the last year. And so all this adds up to the idea that outcomes aren't delivered by organisations. The outcomes we desire are emergent properties of complex systems. So if we want to commission for outcomes, we need to understand how these complex systems produce the outcomes that we want. So this has significant implications for the task of commissioning. Firstly, you can't contract an organisation or a programme to deliver an outcome, because that's simply not how an outcome is made. And contracting and performance managing for outcomes holds people accountable for things they can't control. Because if you think about the number of factors that created the outcomes of obesity, for example, then if you look at the role of the media in creating the outcome of obesity or not, how could you hold a service accountable for whether people are obese or not? And so let's look at what happens if you as a commissioner try to hold organisations or programmes accountable for delivering outcomes, because there's lots of evidence around this and we want our commissioning to be evidence informed, right? So I'm going to sum up a whole number of research articles here with just one slide. So the overall conclusion from an international experience of implementing an outcomes approach is that the journey is long and the results are disappointing. This is from the journal Public Money and Management in 2011. And what the kind of summary of the research articles say is that outcome-based performance management, outcome-based contracting creates gaming. So it turns everyone's job into the production of good-looking data rather than meeting client need. And so if we want to create good outcomes in the world, the task of commissioners is not to purchase services that deliver outcomes, because that's not how outcomes are made. So the question is, what else can we do? And in exploring this question with a whole range of public services over the last 5 years or so, we think that the answer starts by embracing the complexity of the real world. And so what do I mean by that? I mean, let's start by remembering that outcomes are created by complex systems. So to return to the obesity systems map, outcome is the product of all of these different factors working together. So what have we learned about the role of commissioners who are working in this kind of this complex systems way? We've learned that the role of commissioners is to understand the systems that produce the outcomes that you want, and then enable the actors in those systems to learn to produce the desired outcomes. And we call this role of kind of shaping, understanding and learning system stewardship. And that's a way to describe an alternative framing for the task of commissioning. And so what have we learned about what system stewards do and how they work? Well, system stewards seem to follow this kind of learning cycle where it starts by enabling a set of actors to understand the system that creates the outcomes that you want. So to make that as a system visible to the actors involved, to build relationships and trust between those actors, and to establish shared purpose. And then once the actors have that decent understanding about that system and how it works and the relationships involved, moves to a process of co-design where the actors come together to design a series of experiments and explorations that are investigations about how to intervene in these complex, dynamic, ever-shifting systems. And then the results of all of those investigations are embedded into the system itself, and the cycle goes around again. And so it is the creation and maintenance and undertaking of this learning cycle that defines the role of commissioners. And we call this approach the Human-Learning.Systems approach after language that we learned from the people doing it. And you can find more about it at Human.Learning.Systems. Now, I'll dig into each of the key aspects of that now, and I'll kind of reverse the order I normally talk about these in. So let's start with the idea of systems. And effectively, the systems element of this is a recognition that to create a positive outcome, you need the actors in that system to collaborate effectively. So we've seen all the different factors that contribute to making an outcome. Those factors combine to make positive outcomes when they are able to collaborate effectively. And so we just sum this up into the idea that healthy systems produce good outcomes. And so, as I was indicating before, the role of commissioners in this is to help define a purpose for a system so that you can decide which of the actors achieve that purpose in your place and which don't. So you're drawing a boundary around the edges of the system, and then making that system visible to those actors, helping them to understand that they are in a set of relationships that achieve an outcome, building relationships and trust between those actors, and establishing a sense of shared purpose amongst those actors. So commissioners facilitate this process of understanding the system. And some of the questions that commissioners who work in this way ask when they're trying to do this task is, who are the people and organisations which comprise the system which makes the outcome that you're looking for? So who's in and who's out of that system? And in your patch, you will pretty much know the organisations and people that contribute to the outcome that you want. So how do you bring those people together? And then once you've brought those people together, what's the state of play in that system? What are the factors which influence that outcome, and how do those factors relate to each other? What's the relationship between the actors in the system? Do they share information? Do they trust one another? And do the actors in that system understand themselves as a system? Do they have that sense of shared purpose? And so commissioners are undertaking activity that answers these kind of questions. So that's a brief run through the systems bit. Now moving on to the learning. So the in order to enable complex systems to produce good outcomes, we need to understand how complex systems behave. And the complex systems that produce outcomes are unique to each and every person, are made up of hundreds of interdependent factors, like we've seen, are changing all the time, and contain significant elements that are beyond your control as commissioners. So, how do you respond to that, the nature of complex systems in your work? Well, essentially, it means that complexity demands a learning strategy. Because if each person is unique and each system is unique that produces an outcome in that person's life, then the public service response has to start with learning, because it needs to learn the particular conditions of each person's life if it's going to create outcomes in that person's life. It also needs to deal with the fact that what works is different from place to place and time to time. So when the world changes, and the world is always changing, we must learn what works all over again. And again, we see COVID for the details of this idea that the world is always changing. And so this creates the necessity of continuous learning, and creates the idea that commissioners are pursuing this learning as a meta strategy. So questions that commissioners working this way ask themselves are, how will organisations in the system I'm stewarding learn together? How will they identify the key questions that they're asking? How are they going to explore and experiment to continually find new answers? How do they share information and reflect together? How are those that they serve involved in this learning process? And how can I as a commissioner learn alongside them? And then how is this learning process governed to ensure that it focuses on achieving the desired purpose, the outcomes that we want? These are the kind of questions that guide the role of commissioners in creating these learning environments. So it's guiding people through these processes of co-design and experimentation and exploration. And then taking them through so that the results of all of those are embedded and influenced in the system, and governing the learning in that system effectively. So, as a way of summarising this section, we can say that a healthy systems is a learning system, and you as a commissioner can determine how the system that you are stewarding works as a learning system or not. So, moving on to the final section, the human section. This is a set of practices and ideas that relates to the idea that outcomes are unique to each and every human being. So, put most simply, that my well-being is different to yours, different to your neighbours, different to your neighbours. And if you're going to create well-being in my life, you need to understand what well-being means to me as different from the next, from the next, from the next. And the only way that a public service can create, can have that level of understand that unique context of each and every person's life, is through having a high quality relationship with that person. And once public servants have that high quality of relationship to really understand the particular context of each person's life, then they must have the autonomy to respond to whatever the strengths and needs are that they uncover in that relationship. And that means being able to work without key performance indicators or targets, because every time that you set a key performance indicator or a target as a commissioner or as a manager in this world, essentially what you are saying is that I know better what to do in that person's life than that person does themselves and the worker who has that relationship. Because effectively, the only two people who have enough knowledge about what to do to intervene in that person's life are the person themselves, the person being served, and the worker who has a strong enough relationship with them to really understand their context. So they are the only people who have enough knowledge to make that decision, and so they have to have the autonomy to make the decision based on their understanding. And they can do this, they can frame this work, they can make decisions by thinking about the shared purpose that underpins the system, that is broadly given as promoting human freedom and flourishing. So all like the specific examples of purpose that I've seen in systems are essentially varieties of our job here is to promote human freedom and flourishing. So questions for commissioners in this aspect of their work is, which organisations do I trust to build effective relationships with those they serve, to understand and respond to the strengths and needs of each person, to act collaboratively with others to serve the shared purpose? Because you're going to need to trust organisations, because you're going to need to hand over resources to them in a way that enables the workers to act with autonomy. And so you're also going to know what are good reasons for you as a commissioner to trust. Like, why would you trust some organisations and not others? Some answers that we've found that commissioners who work in this way use. We trust the organisations that have open book accounting, that are prepared to open their books to others in the system. We trust organisations that learn well, that learn well in collaboration with others. We trust organisations that are person-centred, that put the person being served at the heart of their decision-making processes. And finally, you might ask, how do I commission so as to build trust? So how do I remove competition between actors? Because that's corrosive of trust. Could I use alliance contracts or grants? Questions like that. And I wanted to kind of finish up by taking this from the learning that we've seen as a whole, working across kind of 40 or 50 different organisations, and giving you a specific example of this in practice. So we can look at the Plymouth Alliance, which is a commission created in the City of Plymouth by the Clinical Commissioning Group and the local authority. It's an £80 million 10-year commission for working with adults with complex needs in the city, using an alliance contracting mechanism. And there's no targets or no KPIs in this contract, in this £80 million contract. The basis that the contract was tendered and let was the idea that organisations are commissioned to learn together to achieve a shared purpose. What they've found from doing that is that learning together builds trust. So the processes of learning together help to create the trust that makes the system work. And also they found that they've created significant cash savings. So for example, they've managed to halve their spending on emergency accommodation by enabling actors to learn and collaborate together. And what they've also achieved is better outcomes for citizens. So fewer homeless people, greater recovery levels. So you've got this kind of holy grail of better outcomes for less money. And in summary, my message for what we've learned from alternative commissioning practice is that this human learning systems approach is a whole different paradigm for public management. So it totally reframes the task and purpose of commissioning. It says you are system stewards because this is how good outcomes are made. So the challenge here is that it takes a lot of hard systems change work and changing some entrenched processes of public management to make this switch. But the payoff for making the switch, and it's entirely possible because we've got a bunch of examples from around the country about how to organisations that have made this choice. The payoff for making this switch is better outcomes for less money and a system in which all the people involved, all the workers and the people that are being served are happier. Like I say, if you want further information, you can find that at the Human.Learning.Systems website. And in May or June, we're publishing a new report which has the experiences of 30 odd case studies and our learning from all of the case studies across the board. We'll be publishing that on the Human.Learning.Systems website either at the end of May or the start of June.